Well, yeah, so I'll just start off by saying that UCC was the first church I went to, and the big part that the church did and the people in it did was knock down all these pre-made dispositions that society and media had placed on me about what church was and about what God was, so that was a big part of it. But to start off, so my name is Jordan, and I'm a recovered drug addict. What made me a drug addict was I had a spiritual condition, an inside problem, and it led me to seek drugs, and after a bit of taking drugs, it led me to get an allergy to the drugs. And in that allergy, it was 0 to 100. There was no rules, and I would do things that I never said I would do. I would hurt people I never said I would hurt. And then there would come a point where I would sober up, and I would be flushed with guilt, shame, and remorse. But then I have this thing called a mental obsession. I have a mental blank spot that there is no thought about all the bad stuff I did and the people I hurt, and I forget about it. There's little or none, and usually it was none. And it drives me back again to that first drug. The allergy comes in. It's just this vicious cycle. It gets progressively worse and worse. So I am recovered from that. That's a whole nother story in itself of how I got there, and we don't have enough time for that. But essentially, I came in contact with a power greater than myself. That was God, that removed that mental obsession, that stopped me from driving. And the allergy is easy to stop as long as I don't take that first drug, but the mental obsession always brings me there. So praise God that was removed. So in my life, I always valued books since I was young, and the reason why I valued books, stories like Lord of the Rings and Harry Potter, all that was my escape. So books were always there, so I've always valued books. And in my addiction, I did lots to die, sometimes purposely, sometimes not, but it just didn't happen. So long story short, then I come into a treatment center that talks about this book, which is the big book of Alcoholics Anonymous. And this book says some really wild things, and I've lived a wild life, so for me to say that this book says some wild things is one thing. But what I didn't know is that this book would lead me to a willingness to believe in a power greater than myself, and then that would in turn, on a step 3, would to give my life and my will over to the care of God, right? So that's just wild in itself for me. But what I didn't know that this book did too was that it would form a relationship with God, right? And then so essentially this book led me to the Bible, which is the Word of God. And this book says even more wild things. There's just so much about it that it is wild. I just remember reading the 4 Gospels, and the stuff that was said in there was super wild. I don't know how to describe it, as I say, but I've been asked to speak on Matthew 28, the Great Commission. And if I look at Matthew 28 as a whole, 1 to 10 is the resurrection, 11 to 15 is the report, and verses 16 to 20 is the Great Commission. And so the 12 steps brought me into a relationship with God, and I was reborn. So a resurrection of me. Then God enabled me to speak of how I got sober and the power that got me sober, which was God. So that is, God has a way to remove the lid and bring the truth of recovery, no matter how hard the enemy seeks to keep it covered. And I'm one who never would speak up here or even talk about God. I wouldn't even talk about myself or my drug use. So that's the report of truth. And now I'm to share on my commission, which for now I work at Jericho Road, which I went to treatment for. So after I completed Jericho Road's 9-month program, society and family would have told me that I need to go to high school and college, because as of right now, I only have a grade 9 education. That's the norm society has placed on what I should do, and I didn't do that, God's plan was for me to stay where I'm at with my grade 9, leave all that behind me. And then I remember reading Matthew 7:14, where it says, "For the gate is narrow and the way is hard that leads to life, and those who find it are few." And I had no idea what hard really meant. I knew that I was going to walk this path, but my life I lived up to this point was hard. The drug use, we don't have time for all that either. But so in my life before God in recovery, by 25 years old, I lost all my family, my mom, my grandma, my grandpa. My father was never involved in my life. This is not to get pity or anything, but this is just to let you know why my heart was so hardened and calloused from the world and everyone in it. So when I think of how my heart is, if you dig up clay and you put it in heat, it just hardens. right? And I had people in my life try and soften my heart, but I was clay at that point, and I was just dried and it was solid. But before I get into my commission, I can't speak of just me. There was 2 people. I asked if I could use their names. Their name are Emily and Brandon. Some of you have heard about them. They are my chosen family. God put them in my life to essentially turn me into wax so that God's heat, we'll say, could melt the heart, right? Because my heart was calloused. And so I asked Emily and Brandon to write why they do what they do, because it's a big part of my story. Spoiler alert, I'm going to get emotional because what I'm going to read, I've literally felt this stuff that they're saying, and so I just figured I have to say this. So every follower of Jesus has a call on their lives to love those around them radically. In 2020, we grew increasingly restless, feeling as if there was more for us to do than we were currently doing. We thought maybe our call was out. We started looking up unreachable places in the world and seriously asked God and ourselves if we were called to be missionaries in Kazakhstan. A wise mentor suggested we try being missionaries in our own backyard first. He was probably just trying to deter us from going to live in a distant country where we knew no one and nothing. But we took it to heart. Our prayer changed to ask God what he wanted from us here as local missionaries. We told him we would do anything, literally anything he wanted. Not long after that, people started showing up in our lives who needed us. A young mom and her 6-year-old son had found themselves homeless, living in a friend's backyard with nowhere to go, and it just happened that our large upstairs room had just become available. We invited them to live with us because there was a need and we could fill it. We didn't have any furniture for them, and their situation was urgent, so we dragged our own mattress upstairs and slept on the floor that night. We did it, we thought. That must be the thing God had wanted us to do, but for some reason, a couple weeks later, we felt we should pray that prayer again. Anything you want us to do, God, we'll do it. Just say the word. We were a little more expectant, red, nervous, praying those words this time, and sure enough, the next day was when I was walking to work. I saw a woman sitting under a tree right outside our business. She was surrounded by all her belongings and clearly in distress. I offered her a coffee and started chatting with her. She ended up telling me her story of an abusive partner, how she lost custody of her kids and turned to drugs to cope, and how she struggled for years with mental illness and homelessness. We cried together, and I felt I couldn't leave it there. I invited her over, and that night we made space in our living room for Danielle to stay as a temporary safe space. You would think with 3 additional people in her house, we would stop asking God anything else. But he had a plan, and we were just going along with it. A few weeks after Danielle moved in, we prayed again, but specifically said, but all the rooms and more in our house are filled up, so maybe you want to send us some other kind of job to do. I kid you not, the very next morning I walked to work and found these 2 people sleeping outside our business door, literally on our doorstep. So that was me and my girlfriend at the time. I didn't have plans to invite them to live with us, but I did invite them for breakfast, and that's the first time we met Jordan, me. His friend was more chatty than him, and after a long talk over breakfast, we offered them a tent in our backyard. We were sure to send a picture of the tent to our mentor to let him know we had taken his advice to be missionaries in our own backyard very seriously. Looking back, I don't know if we were trying to single-handedly solve homeless and drug addiction in St. Thomas, or we were just very faithful to our call to love our neighbors. It mostly sounds crazy when I retell the story. We had 5 additional people live with us for several months, 3 of them with active addictions. We started off very naive about the nature of addiction, and I was a big benefit of that, I can tell you that. Thinking we could solve everyone's problem with a little love and the stability of a place to stay. We quickly realized that our call was not to fix anyone, but to simply love them, whether or not that meant everyone could live with us or not. We felt called to love these friends radically, but mostly consistently. No matter what, love is steady, and we felt that most of them hadn't experienced enough steady love in their lives. Usually, for our 3 friends still struggling with addiction, love meant food and a listening ear. I can't count the number of times we packed to-go bags of someone's favorite snacks, or open the doors to someone in the middle of night who was freezing cold and hungry. Sometimes love meant visiting a friend in jail or advocating for them at Emerge. We had to learn to set up boundaries to stay sane, but when it broke our hearts to say no, God truly showed us his deep love for our friends at that time. His love flowed through us and gave us the ability to be steady when things were hard and complex and messy. Part of our realization about our calling was accepting that we might not see any results. Our friends with addiction lived on the edge of life and death every day. We loved them with the understanding that any day we could be planning their funeral rather than packing them a bag of snacks. Our worst nightmare came true in the fall of 2021 when we lost one of our friends who called us mom and dad to a drug-related illness. Our friend Danielle is still an addict and sometimes homeless. Though our relationship with her stays strong, but God did choose to change Jordan's path dramatically, and we were extremely happy to be a part of that plan. As Jesus followers, our call is to love everyone, but over and over in the Gospels, most marginalized groups, often isolated from their communities, misunderstood, and treated as subhuman at best. God gave us his heart for them. We felt as though we were seeing each person through his eyes, how precious, wonderful, beautiful, and lovable he had made them. What a gift and calling to love how he loves. It may not have been about fixing them, but it changed us. His plan is still unfolding, and we're still grateful to be along for the ride. So that is just a glimpse into what they do. Big things for me that was different was to love those around them radically. My own family had to cut out the relationship with me because of the way I was. And it's not, I don't say that in malice against my family, just they did the best with what they had. You know, and the other key thing there is to not to fix anybody. There was countless times where I went to them complaining about this guy wanting to seriously hurt my life because of my drug addiction, and not once did they say, well, you need to not use drugs and you need to do this. They just would listen and tell me they loved me, you know. So, and all these very hard tasks with human power is definitely impossible, but I know with God all things are possible. And that actually was my very first verse of the Bible that I truly believed and stuck out to me. It was in Matthew 19 where he says, with humans, it's impossible, but with God, all things are possible. And I held on to that for a very long time. But yeah, spoiler alert, in that I was one of the ones who would show up at their doorstep 2 a.m, 4 a.m, 6 a.m, strung out on drugs, freezing and starving. And they never once didn't open their door to give me food. They did that faithfully every time I answered. And I was the one who they visited in jail. I was also the one, jail is such a tough place and there's nothing familiar about it. So I would call her every day at 10 o'clock when I would get out of my cell, and I'd have one free phone call every day for 20 minutes. She would answer it at work and spend that whole 20 minutes talking with me, not condemning me, just listening to me, loving me, you know, and like this is all radical stuff. And like I said, explained earlier, so this is basically part of the melting process. Because if I didn't have this happen in my life, I wouldn't have went to Jericho, and Jericho is a faith-based place. And I'm just gonna, I remember my first Bible I was reading, and in the Gospels, the first 4, there was many wild things, but I used to highlight things in pink that I was just like, this is crazy. Like, this is just nuts. And I'm going to share some of these with you. So in Mark, there's a point where it comes, and calling the crowd to him with his disciples, he said to them, if anyone would come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross and follow me. For whoever would save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life for my sake and the gospel's will save it. For what does profit a man to gain the whole world and forfeit his soul? For what can a man give in return for his soul? That's crazy. I got to do this thing of a cross. But then I read in Luke, it says, if anyone would come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross daily. So I can't just do this once. Like, this is a daily thing. And my life was so bad, but it was still my own. And now you're telling me to give all these ideas up and all these delusions of what I thought I was. Even though they're delusions, I still think that's what I am. And then, like, You lack one thing, go sell all that you have and give to the poor, and you will have treasure in heaven, and come follow me. And I remember reading that just like, I don't have anything. How can I do that? You know? And then this one was like, they're all really tough. This one though, blessed are you when people hate you and when they exclude you and revile you and spurn your name as evil on account of the Son of Man. Because I've had that happen my whole life. You know, people would do that to me, and now I'm blessed. Like, you know, it's just. Then in Matthew again, therefore I tell you, do not be anxious about your life. So when I read that, that was the first thing I was like, I can agree with that. Because if I think of the way I used to live my life, I didn't give a crap about my life. So it's like, this is the one thing I can agree with. But then he goes on to say, don't worry about what you will eat or what you will drink, nor about your body, what you will put on. Is not life more than food and the body more than clothing? I starved myself numerous times. So I read that from the lens of someone who's been homeless and starving, right? And I don't fully understand it. And then yet again, but I say to you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. In my life, my enemies persecuted me, treated me badly, and now you're telling me, so my enemies, I'm to not do that. I'm to somehow break that chain. Well, how do I do that? Because on my own power, I can't do that. I'm just weak. And then obviously, go therefore and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit. So like I said earlier, like Jesus is saying some wild things, and the bar is being set so high, right? And on my own, I can't do that. And, it's been a battle to get to a point to do things asked of me. But I keep reminding myself that it's not my battle. Like, my recovery is not my own. I did some footwork, but God held me up the whole way. Unlike Emily and Brandon, I never prayed for a commission or stuff to do. But as an addict, every morning I need to wake up and pray that my life is not my own, my life is yours. It's not my will, but your will be done. So I'm not directly asking for a commission, but indirectly I'm saying, like, this is not me. It's, to be yours. And then a path got laid at my feet to work at Jericho. And I remember praying, like, someone said to me, like, well, you need to pray before you make decisions. And that was still new to me. I'm like, okay, I'll do that. So I prayed for like 2 weeks and I didn't get anything said. So I went to Emily and Brandon. I'm like, listen, when you pray, am I supposed to hear like a definitive voice being like, yes or no? Right? Like, I don't know. This is all new to me. But they said, like, if you're not hearing anything and there's no definite no, then I think it's safe to say you can say yes. So, I said yes. And one thing I know, I don't know for sure if I was always meant to be an addict, but one thing I do know is that God can use me where I'm at for his purpose, And the crazy thing is I went to Christ for my identity, but I didn't directly go to him for my purpose. But because life, like, I thought my life and who I was my things. And when I lost my family, I thought I lost my identity. So now I'm using drugs and girlfriends and all this to acquire this. And I was just very, very lost. But, when I look at the word commission and I split it up to co and mission, a co is like a joint thing, and a mission is an important task. And with what I'm doing, it's not me doing it by myself. Like, God placed a path before me, but he also walks with me in it, because on my own I definitely couldn't do it. And like, when I think of my addiction, I think of Psalm 91, because it talks about a snare and it talks about the pestilence, and that snare was my mental obsession that kept me trapped in my addiction. The pestilence was my addiction, and the solution to that is for me to rest in the Lord's dwelling place. But how does an addict get there? Well, grace gets me there. And, grace, that's a whole nother wild concept for me, because I am someone with a lengthy criminal record. Most jobs wouldn't hire me, but here's Jericho Road, a place that brought me in, worked with me, and knew where I was, who I was, stuff I did. They knew that the stuff that I did didn't make me who I was. They knew down at the core I was always a child of God, and just external stuff happens, right? And now working there, my role to play is to share with others what my life was like, what happened, and what it's like now. And what happened isn't me up here speaking. It isn't me willing it, like, because my willpower is null, but it's just God. The steps brought me into a relationship with God, and that relationship gets stronger every day. And, you know, since I started working there full time, lots of issues have come up. And when these issues and traumas would come up, I'd be like, man, why couldn't those happen in the 9 months when I was at treatment? You know, but God doesn't reveal things like a bait and switch. He doesn't reveal things for me and then, hey, you're stuck on your own, right? Things get revealed and I get to work through it with him. And I have a job where I work with other people with addictions in the first 6 months. And if you've been an addict, you know the first 6 months is terrible. Just terrible. So it's learning for me, and I'm learning things, and I'm making mistakes, and they will be probably held against me by the residents, you know, when something happens not their way or something. And I don't think of them badly for that, because it's the same thing of meeting people where they're at. They're doing the best that they have with what they have, right? And then, you know, I started reading Romans, and then that says some more wild stuff. But one thing that I had to say to myself a lot is that not only that, but we rejoice in our suffering, knowing that suffering produces endurance, and endurance produces character. And character produces hope, and hope does not put us to shame, because God's love has been poured into our hearts through the Holy Spirit who has been given to us. As an addict, shame brings me to drink and drug probably 1,000,000 times, right? And to have that shame be gone is a pinnacle for sure. And that's my biggest prayer for the guys that I work with, is that shame can be removed, because I know what that shame does. It's an evil, corroding thing that just, as an addict, when we feel shame, there's no hope. Like, if I let shame in, it takes control. There are parts of my job I don't like. I don't like being a disciplinary guy. I was always on the receiving end of the getting disciplined. You would think because I was on the receiving end, I would know a perfect way how to do it. I don't. I just started learning how to talk to people and look them in the eyes like a year ago, you know. And that's tough, but it's helped me learn a lot of things in life. And one part of my job, just like Emily and Brandon's, is I don't get to always see results. Part of my job is to plant a seed. Sometimes I don't water it. Sometimes I don't get to see it harvest, but as long as I get to plant a seed, I consider that a blessing, because there's many times where people get kicked out, unfortunately, and I have to pack someone's bags. A month ago, I had to actually kick somebody out because my coworker, who's been doing this a lot longer than me, wasn't there, and stuff had to be done where this guy couldn't be there anymore. And for me to lose faith would be to say that God doesn't have a plan. So just because they're done at Jericho doesn't mean it's done, towels in, right? So, and I can't understand God's ways. I can try to, but it's just impossible for me to do. You know, and this I don't know. I've never been to church really before. Never been a guy that read churchy books or spoke the language, stuff like that. But I remember once in jail, a month in jail, and my brain is still coming down off of the mass amount of drugs I used to use. And this came into my head, and maybe I've heard it somewhere before, I'm not sure, so I don't want to take credit for this, but I do remember hearing in my head, and of course I hear this, and I'm like, okay, I'm going crazy. That freedom is possible through faith in the process, faith in God. I don't know if that was coined somewhere and I heard it, but I just remember it came to me and I was just like, this is weird. And I wrote it down and sent the letter to Emily and Brandon, because I was like, I need to remember this. This has something. And that's what my job consists of, is just having faith in the process that God is going to do God things, right? And in AA, it talks about a line of transmission, and I was looking that up and stuff. And a transmission line brings power from one area to another, right? And there's that inside wire that the power goes, and then that wire is coated with something. And if I had to equate what my job is, I'm that outside wire, God's the power on the inside, and the best thing I can do for them is to to get them to rely on God. I can't get them to rely on me because I am a human. There are times when I can't go to work, I'm sick, you know what I mean? I need to get them to the power that can do that. And it's definitely a blessing that I get to be that kind of vessel. The other thing about my job too is there's grace to be given, right? I was a recipient of grace numerous times, so who am I to deny others what was so freely given to me? Something I didn't, you know. There are benefits to my job too, and I'm not going to say one of them is what I get paid. And in reality, even if I was paid $40 an hour, $50 an hour, that still doesn't mean more than what I'm going to share with you now. For one, I have a job where I can talk about God freely. I can pray with, well, me and my coworker, we have to pray every morning before we start our shift. I literally have to pray this every day, that I need to be void of anger, quick to listen, and slow to speak. You know what I mean? And the cool thing is we get to close our door and pray. I get to pray with the clients if they want it. You know, I don't shove things down their throat. Like, I'm always a willing body to accommodate speaking with them. You know, and like I mentioned earlier about how for the gate is narrow and the way is hard that leads to life, my job gives life to me, gives me purpose, gives me a reason to wake up, you know, and if I'm not growing spiritually as an addict, I'm reverting back to being an addict, and that spiritual malady and that mental obsession I talked about will come back. And then the other, you know, the crazy thing, this book says, we are like the passengers of a great liner, the moment after rescue from shipwreck, when camaraderie, joyousness, and democracy pervade the vessel from steerage to captain's table. Unlike the feelings of the ship's passengers, however, our joy in escape from disaster does not subside as we go our individual ways. The feeling of having shared in a common peril is one element in the powerful cement which binds us, but that in itself would never have held us together as we are now joined. And when I read that, I definitely think that the elements in the cement that keep my foundation together is, one, it's God. But with these addicts that I work with, we shared a common peril, and we can share in a common solution. So, you know, and one last note before I go in is I talked about how things are, God doesn't do a bait and switch, and I used to believe in coincidences, and this thing happened where I had a random charge on my debit card and I had to get a new debit card, whatever. But my expiry date on the card was 10/26. Now that number has a lot of meaning to me because that's my mother's birthday, and like I said, my mother died when I was younger, and there was so much guilt and shame around anything to do with my mother. So I get this card and I'm like, wow, this is crazy. This number, and it's so great what God has done, because he's enabled me to have these memories, these things that bring up good memories of my mother. I see my mom and hear my mom and other people, and it's joy. I don't cry over it. Well, I do cry over it, but in a good way. But I'm not bogged down by it. And when I was talking with my coworker, I was like, man, this is crazy. This 10:26 came up, and he knows that Matthew was the first book I really, really read, and the verse I liked before was Matthew 19:26, right? And he's like, well, what is it in Matthew? And you know, when I look at Matthew 10:26, it is, nothing is covered that will not be revealed, or hidden that will not be known. And one thing I've realized is that God is going to reveal things, and things will be known. Sometimes I don't get to be the part of the knowing, but I know that God will do that in the people that I get to work with. So thank you for listening.